things. Right. I think what I'm going to talk about follows on extremely well from what Andrea is talking about, okay? Because I think there's the issue of gender as a human right, and whether gender is an integral part of democracy, whether you can actually talk about people having democratic values if they don't respect gender as a human right. The second question is the issue of the norms and values, which are codified in law. So the family code, the Sharia family code, and what that. And the third one is the issue of what it, not just what people want, but what sorts of policies are likely to deliver, particularly what women want in terms of progressing the ways in which they can have greater autonomy, the ways in which they can move forward. So I think in that sense it fits. I will add one point, which is that like Andrea, I would be critical of the notion that the EU can go out and sell what it is or what its policies are, and that often creates resentment. But I would also point out that Sylvia Wolby, in a very powerful analysis of EU gender policy, has argued very strongly that the EU does actually have a gender policy which is worth selling. In other words, the ways in which the EU have developed gender policy and gender mainstreaming is actually a model. That it doesn't mean that entrepreneurs can then go out and expect people to buy it and accept it as a good, but it is there, and that's important to remember. Right, so what do we know about gender equality and the empowerment of women in the MENA region? And we know from all the research, from all the indexes, that the MENA region have some of the highest levels of inequality, discrimination against women in the world. They're not unique. Anyone often think Morris aren't totally correct in that, but they do as a cluster. And one thing that is particularly central to this is the very low proportion of women in paid employment. There the graph shows the percentage compared to men, but if I showed it compared, and you can see compared with women in other middle-income countries, the proportion is very low. For those who want to argue for women's employment on economic grounds, it's estimated that the MENA countries lose about 25% of their GDP purely by having so few women in the labour market. Beyond that, young women are particularly disadvantaged in the labour market, and in some countries, some of the MENA countries, particularly Egypt, the proportion of young women, that is those who would actually like to be employed, which is in itself a relatively small proportion, over half are unemployed. So there's huge unemployment among women, not in all the countries, but in most of the countries it's significantly higher than young male unemployment, which itself is much higher than unemployment for older men and women. So gender inequality. Again, if we look at the OECD social index and gender index, now this is very heavily a measure of what government is doing, what the laws are, progress in health and education. And we can see that at that level, there are very large differences in the MENA region. Egypt is very high in terms of inequality. Morocco is relatively low. Tunisia is actually in the medium category, and Iraq and Jordan are in the high category. And you can see Yemen is the highest. It isn't one of our sample. So there is still significant gender inequality at the level of the institutional frameworks, the laws. But we can't talk about the Arab region as if it was all the same. And I think that's important that we recognize that. So I've already said, gender inequality is holding the MENA region back. It's actually According to the research, and I'll come back to this later, holding the region back for two reasons. The research shows that stable democracies not only have high proportions of the population supporting democracy, but also have high proportions of the population who support gender equality. In the MENA region, you've heard Andrea questioning what they mean by democracy, but in this earlier research, the people have accepted the answer to democracy is the best system and said, right, 80% in the MENA region want democracy, but they don't want gender equality. So, and that's actually untrue, because if you look at the Arab Barometer 3, they all want gender equality as well, when they just ask that question. So it's when we do the more detailed investigation of what it means to say, I want gender equality, I want democracy, that we begin to see that there are subtle, well not subtle, very, very, very strong differences. It's not the same. Women are good for development, right? I hate saying that, but women are good for development. I hate saying it because it then leads the World Bank to say women are smart economics and not to think about all the baggage that goes with encouraging, cajoling women to go into employment, married women to go into employment, so that in effect asking women to take on the double or in some cases the triple burden. So women don't automatically benefit from development. Large amount of research, global research, that what happens when women move into the labour market is they just take on more work. Women work far longer hours than men when you take into account domestic labour, and even in what are seen as egalitarian societies like Sweden, that remains the same. So we have to be clear, women don't necessarily benefit. And they also don't necessarily benefit in that it was assumed under many theories that as countries grew, as the economies grew, women would automatically move into the labour market. That is also not the case. Again, the MENA countries to a large extent do demonstrate that. Right? The EU, at least in its new neighbourhood policy, talks very strongly about promoting women's rights being a priority. Our respondents certainly don't see it as a priority. I mean, Andrea showed slides where it wasn't even asked, but even when we ask it, very few. Slightly more in Morocco and Tunisia, but very few see it as a priority. What they do see as a priority from the EU, and colleagues will later talk more about this, I'm sure, is support for economic growth and development, for jobs, for education, for health. But they certainly don't see promoting gender equality. What about attitudes? If we go through the various normally when we look at attitudes to gender, we look at education, employment, legal position. And so I'm just going to take you a bit through that because we get some interesting things. On the whole, there's not a huge proportion that say a university education is more important for a boy than a girl. But we notice quite a strong gender difference. Women are much less likely to think so than men, apart from Libya. And that has changed. If we look at earlier World Value Survey, that has gradually changed. When a slightly different question is asked in the Afrobarometer, you find that the proportion who think that boys should get prioritised over girls goes up. When it becomes a question of scarcity of resources to send everyone to school and things like that. But on a straight question, There's that, and we know that in the MENA countries now there is near gender parity in education, proportions going to primary and secondary school and in university to a large extent. Attitudes to women's employment. Well, quite a high proportion of respondents, slightly less so in Egypt, particularly Egyptian men, but also women, think that married women should have the right to go out to work. You see, they don't, but there's quite strong support. Support's particularly high among women in countries other than Iraq. But then when we asked, if jobs are scarce, who should have priority? Male breadwinner model, men have to have a job to support their wives and families in the style to which they're accustomed. It's really interesting. Very high proportion of men in all the countries think, yeah, we us men have to have priority. But look at Morocco, and to a lesser extent Tunisia and Libya. Much less support for the prioritising of men over women, among women. And in Morocco, so again, it's quite interesting to look at the people's attitudes. One of the questions we asked in the ArabTrans survey, which has not been asked before, is for married people, what proportion had their name on the marriage, on the housing certificate? You can see very few women. Highest in all the men do, it's about 99% or something for men. But for women, very few have their name. Now, that has huge consequences for women in terms of their economic security, etc., etc. And again, very low support among men, not that, but higher among women, for having employment being a way for women to get independence. So again, the sort of attitude that perhaps employment isn't the best thing for women. Again, very strong, except in Morocco. I did actually query it with our Moroccan partners, have they coded the variable correctly, and they assure me they have, for the view that men make better political leaders than women. And that's hugely important because we know that gender issues do not get onto the table at national level or local level, if you're talking about that, unless there are women there. And we know that the proportion that we need of women, or ethnic minorities, or whatever group, is at least 30% to ensure that their voices are heard. The argument would be if people's voices aren't heard, then their priorities, what they value, is not going to get addressed. The basis for personal status law. Andrea mentioned this and the strong support for the personal status law. And you can see that across all the countries, with the partial exception of Tunisia, Tunisian men and women, there is very strong support for traditional Sharia law being the basis of personal status law, and very little support. Again, Morocco, Tunisia being the exception probably because in practice its law has been civil since the 1950s, for the law being purely civil. The middle position is one where the argument is that Sharia should be interpreted in the light of modern circumstances, so rather than being seen as the word that has to be followed. Here, Andrea mentioned the issue of democracy and other types of government, when we actually asked people what type of government they want. And he pointed out that we have two clear clusters or factors: those that want unrestricted parliamentary democracy, by which we mean that all types of parties can stand, and those that want other types of systems. And this shows you that it's only in Iraq that a majority want an unrestricted parliamentary system, and there's very low support for an unrestricted parliamentary system in Libya, Jordan, and Morocco. Interestingly, in Jordan, virtually 50% of the respondents want an Islamic authority, and about 30% in Morocco want an Islamic authority without a parliament. I can't remember the exact wording of the question, but it's an Islamic authority without elections or without parliament. If we look at the mean on an index of gender equality, we can see it's low. I mean, you might think, looks quite high, it's low. If I recompute that and do it as who scores at least 7 on a scale that goes from 0 to 10, it's around 17% across the sample. So support for gender equality on our index is low. I've got details of how I constructed it. It's higher, obviously, among women. When I actually analyse it in more detail, Morocco stands out as having the highest support for gender equality, and Libya and Egypt the lowest. So, what are the policy implications? Well, clearly, policies need to be both top-down and bottom-up. There has to be a legal framework. There has to be gender machinery. But that in itself is insufficient. You have the best gender machinery and legislation and still have a highly patriarchal society. So you also have to work with women and men to encourage people to understand the importance of gender equality. For women to be able to exercise their rights, there has to be a legal framework. They have to know what those rights are. They have to know, that I have this right. They have to be able to exercise that right. They have to have access to courts of law in order to be able to claim those rights if necessary. And they have to be able to claim and exercise them. Sorry, I got that a bit muddled. But they have to be able to claim and exercise them. So they have to have access to law courts, and they have to be able to exercise them. The cultural norms and values have to enable women to be able to exercise their rights. The EU would be much better, I think, focusing on practical support for improving women's rights. That just working at the level of encouraging attitudes of gender equality, etc., etc. What is really needed, what our respondents are telling us they want, where I think there's room to move in and begin to promote better ideas about gender equality, is working at the level of employment creation, but in a way that replicates what the European Union has done. That is, putting in place mechanisms that support women in employment. It's no good just going and opening lots of factories that provide a job for women. You've got to be able to think about childcare and equal opportunities, equal pay, anti-gender discrimination at work, etc., etc. So we need to do that. And finally, in the past, the EU, for a lot of reasons related to the rise of political Islam and other reasons, has tended not to work with the NGOs that are specifically based on Islamic feminism. And it's essential that the EU takes on board and works with those women, because they do have a powerful voice and they are part of the movement for improving women's rights. So I think what we're saying is we need to listen to what people are saying, and we need to think what we mean when we talk about democracy, what we mean when we talk about women's rights, and how we actually help improve the lives of people in the region.